On the issues of gender, I will say there is kind of unconscious bias. And so if you're working with somebody who is a different, you're trying to raise money from somebody who's a different gender than you, or a different cultural background, or a different socioeconomic background, they're going to be looking at you and judging you in ways that are different than they might judge somebody who looks just like them. And I think you want to be aware of those biases and work early on to find your own voice. It's important that you find and develop confidence in your voice in situations where you don't look like the others. For me, I'd say early on, once I was in venture, I realized that I was almost always the only woman around the board table. And I really had to, in many cases, I felt that it was gender blind. I was on boards where I didn't feel that I had to do anything different to be heard or to be seen. Some of that is because you're the lead investor and you have the checkbook, which changes the way people look at you a little bit. But there were other boards where I was the lead investor and wrote the biggest check, and I did not have an equal voice at the table, and I had to find it. One of the things that I learned for myself was I noticed that around the board table, at least in boards I was on, people were very, very interested in being heard, but not very interested in listening. And so I found my most effective voice in almost every board I'm on, and playing that role of helping people hear each other. Not that I don't speak up and make sure my own voice is heard too, but I found it remarkably powerful when you can step back and listen and make sure other people are being heard, the influence you can have by playing that role in a group setting.
It's not a straightforward answer. The reason is a lot of it is our preconceived as well, but a lot of it exists, right? There's two sides of the table. So you need to assess the situation. And then I work with so many founders and investors. End of the day, none of my female founders or female investors want the money because they're women, right? They want the money because their fund is just badass. Like, sorry for using language, but it's just such an amazing product. And you're investing in my product and not because I'm a woman, right? Like there's not a sympathy vote at this moment. But with that said, I think make sure you're delivering what you need to deliver, right? And then when you see that bias exists, then you need to kind of head on, right? Address it. But make sure that that bias is existing and you've done your part in terms of delivering the product. You've delivered your pitch. And then if that exists, it is, let's just face it, right? But then that's kind of how you need to do it. But I just want to also warn that there's always that you're going into that fear, right? Don't give into that fear. Don't give into that fear because you're better, right? Like I would, especially I see that at the early stages. So I would want the female founders to go into the room as much as how a male founder would go in, and then do what you need to do, and then address if you still see the problem. I mean, Beckie, that's because I just had this conversation with a young female founder coming out of university. So it was like so raw. That's why I was like nodding. Oh my God, that's exactly. It might be.
Well, the other thing I would say, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Beckie.
The other thing I was going to say is I think, at least for me, I try to keep the discussions at the factual and business realm and out of the emotional realm. And so if you're able to address the actual issues, regardless of how you might sense you're being interpreted, you can break through that oftentimes. So I would caution people, especially early on, not getting kind of baited into that kind of an interaction, because I think it works against you in the short term. I'll also say, when I look back at my mentors, my very first mentor was gender blind. He just was. But some of the other very important mentors I've had in my career were the ones that maybe told a dirty joke here and there, came from an old school and had some built-in biases based upon their age and the time they grew up, or just were thoughtless about how certain things they said or did might affect somebody else. And yet they have been some of my strongest mentors. And we both learned in that relationship. As the trust grew at a professional level and a personal level, I was able to say, hey, do you realize that when you do this, this is the situation it puts me as a woman in? It's extremely uncomfortable. But until we built that relationship, he wouldn't have been able to hear that. So if I had just kind of been baited into a discussion about it, he never would have heard that. He wouldn't have learned. I wouldn't have had the benefit of a fantastic mentor. So I think there's some nuance and subtlety about how it does exist. You will find it in the workplace. And I think learning how to use them as opportunities for growth for both you and them, I think, is another piece of advice I would give.
So I really think you should address it head on in most situations. There's a lot of data showing when investors speak with male founders, they focus on the vision and the potential of the company, where when they speak with female founders, they focus on questions that's kind of asking you to justify how you're not going to fail. So I think there are moments like do some research about what are some of those questions that's starting to hint at and refocus them. It's like, I want to focus you on the potential on the market size, like speak with data, speak with numbers, so they can't argue with numbers. The numbers speak for themselves. The other thing I would say, there are times that I'm in conversations where people list all these like successful people, or people throw out the suggestions for board members, and if I realize it's all men, I pointed out, I said every candidate you have suggested are men. What is your view on diversity? I think those are practical things that someone can do in a pitch or in a conversation like that. And the last bit of tip is, if you want, you can record yourself pitching. And when you watch yourself pitch, you're going to realize where are the areas that you don't find yourself feeling confident. You're like, pulling back a little, and work on those and make sure those are the areas that, investor cannot press you on.
If I can say, coming from a corporate side of the world, you have to make yourself known. You have to kind of raise your hand. You have to kind of voice up a little bit. And this is like +1 on what Momo said. That happens all the time, especially in the corporate world. You do need to raise up. And sometimes you're looked at, oh my God, she's too loud. And I've heard that, trust me, over my years. But it's okay to be loud, because that you can't hear me, But make sure when you say when everyone is listening, make sure that words matter, right? That word, don't lose that moment, because that moment is the one that kind of defines if they're going to lean in to listen to you more. Yes, we do need to work a little bit more, but that moment, make sure capture it, show why they need to listen to you a lot more in the future. So that's what I would say, Alice.
I'd say the other thing is, the other thing that's fairly common is for a woman to say something and it not get heard, and 10 minutes later the man to say what you said, and everyone nods their head in agreement. And I think that's another place where you need to, well, thank you so much for restating that. I really appreciate you brought that my issue back to the group. You can find polite but direct ways of making sure that your voice is heard and recognized as your voice.
That's very good advice, suggestion. I would say